Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We begin with the White House at war with reality on two fronts, pounding the lie from the podium that the Democrats are responsible for political hate speech, along with trying to characterize Trump's would-be assassin, who appears to have evangelical roots, as anti-Christian. We'll discuss how Ted Kaczynski, Luigi Mangione, and Cole Allen wrote manifestos claiming they were acting for the greater good, but what they end up achieving is often the opposite, as was Trump's recent assassination of Iran's leadership, which was replaced by an even harder-line regime. Joining us is Bill Scher, the politics editor at the Washington Monthly, who is the host of the history podcast When America Worked, and the co-host of the bipartisan online show and podcast, the DMZ. We'll discuss his article at the Washington Monthly, Don't Murder People. Besides being immoral, political assassins repeatedly fail to achieve their intended objectives. Then we'll examine Trump's tactic of attacking the messenger in order to avoid discussing the message, as he shuts down female reporters with misogynistic barbs like "Quiet, Piggy," or in the case of Norah O'Donnell on 60 Minutes, "You're a disgrace." Joining us is Peter Loge, a professor and the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs and director of the Project on Ethics and Political Communication at George Washington University. He has more than 30 years of experience in politics and communications, including a presidential appointment at the Food and Drug Administration, and he held senior positions for Senator Edward Kennedy and 3 members of the United States House of Representatives. Then finally we'll assess what kind of repair job King Charles is doing for Anglo-American relations with his charm offensive at the White House and the U.S. Congress today. Joining us is Toby Miller, a British Australian-American cultural studies and media studies scholar. He is the Distinguished Professor in Media and Cultural Studies at Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey in Guadalajara, Mexico, and has taught at Cardiff University and Loughborough University in London, and was a professor at New York University. He hosts the podcast Cultural Studies, and his most recent books include Violence, The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture, How Green is Your Smartphone, and A Better World. And before we begin with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump cacistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power, as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now is Bill Scher, who's the politics editor at the Washington Monthly. He is the host of the history podcast When America Worked and the co-host of the bipartisan online show and podcast The DMZ. And he has an article at the Washington Monthly, Don't Murder People. Besides being immoral, political assassins repeatedly fail to achieve their intended objectives. Welcome to Background Briefing, Bill Scher.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you as always.
Well, thanks, Bill. And I like the fact that you closed up your article by saying that I feel it necessary to write 1,500 words on why murder is bad. Feels like we've taken another step down the dark path of idiocracy. And of course, the movie Idiocracy is one of my favorite movies. The screenwriter of the movie, by the way, was recently interviewed, and he said at the time that they were making the movie, they didn't realize that they were making a documentary.
Well, President Camacho in Idiocracy is arguably more open to hearing new ideas and elevating discourse compared to what we were seeing right now.
Well, but what they're doing now, the White House, is trying to invert the discourse by saying that the Democrats are to blame for the poisonous and toxic political discourse we have.
Yeah, I mean, that's just straight gaslighting and blame shifting. I mean, how many years do we hear conservatives complain about woke people making it impossible to perform a stand-up comedy and how it was ruining the culture? And you literally have the president trying to fire comedians because they make jokes about him. And where are all those people who are so anti-woke? Where are they right now?
Well, but I think that leads to questions that haven't been asked about the origins of this White House Press Association's dinner, which is the first one that Trump has attended. He's missed the previous four, or five, I guess. And what happened, as far as I can see, is that Larry Ellison's son, who's now bought Warner Brothers, which the White House has to approve that acquisition, but he already owns CBS. Prior to the dinner, on Thursday last, they had a private, what they called intimate dinner that Ellison's son hosted at the renamed U.S. Institute of Peace, now called the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace, at which all of the CBS people were there, along with Barry Weiss, and the MC and head of the White House Press Association. She's the CBS's White House correspondent who was there on the dais with Trump at the dinner or banquet on Saturday night. And it's pretty clear that the fix was in as much as Trump hates comedians. The whole point of the White House Press Association dinners was to roast the president in a kind of jovial way. And Trump can't stand comedians, can't stand being made fun of. So they bring in this mentalist. So to my mind, the table was already set for a sellout to an oligarch, for God's sake.
Well, I would take it a slight step farther. The point of the event, this is the White House Correspondents Association that hosts the event. I mean, it's a fundraiser. They're raising money for their educational programming and their scholarship programs. But the event itself is supposed to be a celebration of the First Amendment. To have a comedian come and roast the president is a fulfillment of First Amendment values. You are showing that you live in a country where you can make fun of the president to his face and not go to jail the next day, and not lose your job the next day. And they seem so bent out of shape that Trump wouldn't attend the event that they restructured the event to his liking. We won't have a comedian roaster. We'll have a mentalist who's very well beloved in the manosphere, according to the New York Times, and that made it okay for Trump to attend. You're already and I'm not someone who really hates on most White House journalism. You know, if you judge the work, you know, I'm not a hater of the event of itself. Some people are, and they're welcome to that opinion. I'm not. I think you can have a social event, and have a drink, have a dinner with somebody, and then still go do your job the next day. I judge you on your work, but when you are having a person in Donald Trump who is an active enemy of the First Amendment, he has already tried to use the levers of government to suppress speech, and then use him to celebrate the First Amendment. You are in it, regardless of your journalism the next day, separate from the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. In that moment, you are helping somebody undermine the First Amendment by making him seem like he's not an enemy of the First Amendment.
Well, let's go through the points that you make in your article, Bill. Don't murder people at the Washington Monthly. You cite, for example, the killing of the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, by Luigi Mangione. The Democratic Speaker of the Minnesota House, Melissa Hortman and her husband, were murdered by an anti-abortion activist. Conservative activist Charlie Kirk was murdered. The Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, was murdered. And, the list actually could expand beyond that. It should be clear to everybody that political assassinations, or actually you can go back even further to the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. It's amazing to think that smart people And you mentioned in your article, Ken Klipperstein reviewed Allen's manifesto and observed that this new crop of assassins are not crazy, marginal people with mental issues, but rather highly educated people. But nevertheless, they're capable of incredible stupidity, in the sense if they really thought that killing somebody, or particularly a president, would further their cause, they could not be further wrong. And the evidence in all the cases you brought up is overwhelming, is it not?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear. You can literally assassinate the leader of a country, the supreme leader of Iran, and you can say the next day, "I've done it. I've executed regime change, the whole new regime." It's not true. The regime is the same. It's the same. The regime is not embodied by a single individual. There's multiple levels of bureaucracy and military strength and a fundamental ideology that binds it all together. That is unchanged by the murder of one individual. You can murder individual healthcare industry executive. You have not changed the healthcare industry by doing that. You've not changed any healthcare policy by doing that. You can tell yourself by killing Charlie Kirk, you're doing something to stop hate. But all the ideas that Charlie Kirk had still live on, and if not, perhaps even amplify, because his supporters, including the president, have martyred him and made him an icon because of it. You're not doing the work of real social change, political change, foreign policy change through the shortcut of murder. Because real changes, it involves much harder work, and there aren't shortcuts to it. And I do think it's a seeming connection between Cole Allen, who had the attempted assassinations at the Correspondents' Dinner, and Luigi Mangione, who did murder Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO. They both had sort of similar educational backgrounds. Very high level. Mangione was UPenn, Allen was Caltech. Both were computer engineers. Both left manifestos that seem to suggest that they had a unique ability and courage and charge to do something that no one else was willing to do, which is inherently a delusion of grandeur. And so they might be very smart in certain areas of under certain criteria, under certain subjects, but they succumb to very crude, simplistic thinking, fed by their egos, fed by megalomania, and now both are likely to be incarcerated for the rest of their lives because of it.
Well, in the case of Luigi Mangione, you point out that in many ways he was influenced by the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, who Luigi Mangione had singled out for praise. So I guess what happens in these cases is that the sort of political issues, the gravity and importance of a political issue overwhelms the simple questions of human morality. Again, going back to the Old Testament, thou shalt not kill. I mean, we talked yesterday with Ken Klippenstein about the manifesto by Cole Allen and his religiosity. Clearly, he's quoting the Gospel according to St. Matthew. But again, the Beatitudes and the Gospel according to St. Matthew still somehow don't overcome the strictures of the Ten Commandments, surely.
Yeah, I mean, Allen, from what we know, and I know a lot is from Klippenstein's reporting, seemed to be a very devout evangelical Christian, and clearly thought it was important in his manifesto to justify what he was doing. I mean, if not quite based on Scripture, he seemed to be arguing that at least it wasn't disallowed by Scripture and in his interpretation. But he's putting himself in the position of judgment. He is seeing himself as someone who has to take matters into his own hands to the most extreme degree because what Trump is doing is so terrible. Now, what Trump is doing is so terrible, but he did not solve anything. Whether he succeeded in killing or not wasn't going to solve anything. Even if Trump was dead or other people in the administration was dead, it would still be his administration. It would be J.D. Vance. It would be other people perpetrating those ideas. It doesn't change the fact that those ideas would live on, and the way to combat those ideas is to do the harder work of public opinion persuasion and electoral change. The case of Mangione, you mentioned him citing Kaczynski in his diaries. He was arguing he was going to do Kaczynski one better. Kaczynski had in his mind. I mean, I'll quote from his diaries directly. This is Mangione writing. "This is the problem with most militants that rebel against often real injustices. They commit an atrocity, either whose horror outweighs the impact of their message, or whose distance from their message prevents normies from connecting the dots. What do you do?" So this is now Mangione talking about what he's going to do. "You whack the CEO at the annual parasitic bean counter convention. It's targeted, precise, and doesn't risk innocence." Mangione thought that Kaczynski, whatever his merits, was too random in his targets, and therefore failed to persuade the public on his ideas. And Mangione was going to do better than Kaczynski. He's going to kill one individual person who personifies all the evils of the healthcare system, and therefore he is going to be able to move public opinion and enact change that way. And we can say, why are you focusing on just a couple of individual sociopaths? The problem is that the kernels of these ideas are getting broader currency, and we saw this in this New York Times podcast roundtable, which just was published a week or so ago, that featured Hassan Piker, who has become a very prominent influencer and streamer, and Gia Tolentino, who writes for the New Yorker, and they both were expressing a degree of sympathy for what Mangione did, and Tolentino in particular, made arguments that really parallel, whether she understood this or not, parallel what Mangione was writing in his diary. She called the murder of the CEO, quote, "an effective act of political consciousness raising," unquote, that she thought that Democrats in Washington should have leveraged. And she said she was, quote, "disappointed," unquote, that they didn't do it, that they should immediately take this up by pushing a unified message towards universal health care. So both Piker and Tolentino said at the very end, well, I don't think it's okay to murder a CEO. They wouldn't do it themselves. But that was after spending a lot of time arguing for sort of justifying it, rationalizing it, making excuses for it, and arguing that it should be exploited for good ends. And what that argument misses is, the Mangione argument that by narrowing the target, you're going to deliver a better political message that the normies could connect the dots with. The polling that came out afterwards showed the exact opposite was true. So Emerson College did a poll days after the murder, and they asked if the actions of the killer of the United Healthcare CEO were acceptable or unacceptable. 68% unacceptable, 17% said acceptable. So that's a whole lot of normies who didn't connect the dots the way Mangione hoped they were going to, and the way Tolentino thinks the Democrats should have assumed they were going to. So the logic just doesn't work, and it's embraced by people who, this is sort of like mansplaining to an exponential degree. I know something, and I have so much courage, and I am so important that when I put the gun in my hand, I'm going to change the world, and it does not work out that way.
Well, it also makes liberals look ridiculous and even, to put it mildly, naive politically, because after all, there's now a musical and it played in San Francisco, had a sellout run, Luigi the musical. And this, in effect, diminishes the reality that, again, it's not liberals that are the problems in terms of hate speech. It's the right, particularly the MAGA right. After all, Trump himself, when there was a kidnapping plot against the Michigan Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Trump said the conviction of the victims of those that were convicted was a railroad job. The near-fatal attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, the Republicans made fun of, and Trump joked about it. And, you point out in your article that last September, Paul Becker and Art Jimson of the University of Dayton sociology professors observed that since 2001, approximately 75 to 80% of U.S. domestic terrorism deaths were caused by right-wing extremist violence. So the left is shooting itself in the foot by making heroes out of assassins.
So you run that risk, and you already see people on the right, holding up, Piker in particular, for various things that he has said. He said, last year, I think it was last year, if you care about Medicare fraud, you should kill Rick Scott, the right-wing senator from Florida, who used to be a healthcare executive. So even though going back, the last couple decades, domestic terrorism is far more right-wing activity than left-wing activity. It only takes a couple people on the left to start talking about it as if it's a good idea for the right to then cherry pick those quotes and make it seem like all the left is doing it. And it doesn't help when you have someone like a Mangione or someone like an Allen, take up the argument and try to carry it through. So I'm not trying to, both sides this and say whether it's more or less on one side or the other is sort of not my point here. My point is that it's a dumb idea. And again, the logic of it was being used by Donald Trump just a month ago in trying to murder and successfully murdering the leader of Iran, and thinking that was going to be the shortcut. The hard fought nuclear deal negotiated by Barack Obama and the Secretary of State John Kerry, which actually contained the Iranian nuclear program and was working when Donald Trump pulled out of it, a few years later. That took a lot of work. That took years of work. That took a very determined and diligent and patient and tenacious negotiation strategy to get to that deal, which Trump acted like was a disaster, and he sabotaged it. And ever since he sabotaged it, that's when the Iranian nuclear program went into overdrive. And now he's going to be the savior by fixing it by murdering the supreme leader and dropping a lot of bombs. And he's finding out the hard way that he hasn't changed much of anything. I mean, he killed a bunch of people, but he hasn't changed the regime. He hasn't changed the nature of the Iranian nuclear program. If anything, gives them more incentive to finish the job and get a nuclear bomb, because that is the ultimate protection against this kind of hawkish foreign policy. But negotiations take work, and if you have a certain degree of megalomania and impatience, you go for the shortcut, and the shortcuts don't get the job done.
Well, Bill Scher, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure as always. Take care.
You too. And again, I've been speaking with Bill Scher, who's the politics editor of the Washington Monthly and the host of the history podcast When America Worked, and the co-host of the bipartisan online show and podcast The DMZ. And he has an article at the Washington Monthly, Don't Murder People. Besides being immoral, political assassins repeatedly fail to achieve their intended objectives. We're going to take a brief station break and back, examining Trump's tactic of attacking the messenger in order to avoid discussing the message, as he shuts down female reporters with misogynistic barbs like Quite Piggy, or in the case of Norah O'Donnell on 60 Minutes, You're a Disgrace.
Kids with guns, taken over, but it won't be long. They're mesmerized, skeletons. Kids with guns, easy does it, they got something to say. Drinking out, pacify, feeling
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Peter Loge, who's a professor and the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs and director of the Project on Ethics and Political Communication at George Washington University. He has more than 30 years of experience in politics and communications, including a presidential appointment at the Food and Drug Administration, and he held senior positions for Senator Edward Kennedy and 3 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome to Background Briefing, Peter Loge.
Many thanks for the invitation. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thanks for joining us, Peter. And you're quoted in an article at the Huffington Post about Trump's meltdown with Norah O'Donnell on 60 Minutes on Sunday. The article's called Perfect Storm. Trump berated a female journalist in latest attack, and it's quite telling. But I think what's telling about this is that isn't this a part of a pattern? I mean, it's not just Norah O'Donnell that he, was aggressive and disgusting and insulting towards, but we all record him shutting down a female White House journalist saying, "Quiet, piggy." Surely this is a tactic of attacking the messenger in order to avoid discussing the message. Isn't that what he's doing?
Well, yeah, President Trump has a long history of attacking anybody who criticizes him, sort of across the board. He also has a long history of attacking the press, reporters who are doing their job. And he has a long history of misogyny. And when you add up the 3, you have a female reporter, woman reporter asking a hard question. Trump's first reaction is going to obviously be to lash out and to be critical.
But that way he avoids answering the question, right? So would it be incumbent upon reporters, male or female, to say, "Mr. President, would you mind answering the question?"
It is a good way to avoid answering the question. Most politicians are pretty adept at avoiding answering questions, or they tend to answer the question that they want to answer, not the one you want to ask. I spent a career in politics, as you said, advising candidates on how to do that. And yeah, I mean, a good reporter will follow up, but I'm not sure the follow-up would be in the case of O'Donnell. I mean, she read some pretty ridiculous stuff from a manifesto and then tried to do kind of this weird gotcha, "Oh, you think it's about you." Like, as a follow-up, then, "Sir, are you actually a pedophile?" To which the answer is always going to be, "Of course not. Why are you asking me that?" There's no world in which any elected official will say to a journalist, "Ho, got me. I've been fooling the American people." So, yeah, I mean, clearly journalists have to ask follow-up questions. They have to ask harder questions. And if you're in a pool, I would love to see journalists following up on the previous question, right? So if somebody from AP is called on by the president dodges the question. The next reporter is from the Wall Street Journal. I'd love it if the Wall Street Journal reporter said, "Sir, I have a follow-up to the AP's question," to keep pushing that thread. But those questions also have to be ones where there's something to be learned rather than, a click to be had or a partisan point to be made.
So it seems at the moment, Peter, the 2 White House offensives underway. They're attacking on 2 fronts. One is that the assassin, or the would-be assassin, Cole Allen, who is clearly, from his manifesto, appears to be an evangelical Christian, is anti-Christian. They're pushing that one hard. And the other angle that they're pushing hard is, particularly with the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, is that it's the Democrats who are responsible for political hate speech. So how's that going?
I'm not sure what the alleged would-be assassin's faith has to do with anything. I'm not sure I don't know. I went to St. Thomas's Day School in New Haven, Connecticut a very long time ago, but I don't remember reading much about like the importance of shooting people. I'm pretty sure that's not part of any serious faith, at least not in a situation like this. I mean, obviously the president is going to blame the Democrats. Democrats are going to blame Republicans. Everybody's going to blame everybody. I think the appropriate response is political violence is unacceptable. Hard stop. Like, that's it. It should be condemned. It is rare. It's becoming increasingly popular, like it's happening more and more, which is awful. And the way to stop it isn't to say, "Yeah, you think we're bad, you should see those other guys." The way to stop it is for Democrats and Republicans, elected officials and candidates at every level to say, this is not okay. In democracies, we argue, we don't shoot. That's the point. And then move on.
So a celebration of the First Amendment in many ways became a question of the misinterpretation, or at least the Supreme Court's interpretation, of the Second Amendment. Do you think that the Second Amendment overshadowed the First Amendment on Saturday night?
Okay, so the White House Correspondents' Dinner is many things, but I'm not sure it's a celebration of the First Amendment. It's in DC, we call it Nerd Prom. It creates a lot of traffic in my neighborhood. And it's a bunch of reporters. It's an important institution, and a lot of serious journalists get together to celebrate serious journalism, but also to have some fun, sometimes at the expense of the press, sometimes at the expense of guests. One piece of folklore is that Donald Trump ran for president because then President Obama made fun of him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2014. There were a number of journalists who'd signed on to a letter saying that the president should stop attacking the free press. But the White House Correspondents' Dinner isn't a serious anything. It's a big dinner party for a bunch of journalists who celebrate each other, as they should. But, I'm not sure it has anything to do with the Second Amendment. I have feelings about the Second Amendment, but I'm not an attorney. I slept through my pre-law class because it was taught by my debate coach in college. And whether or not people are allowed to have access to guns really has nothing to do with whether or not the president of the United States or anybody else should be calling their political opponents enemies, right? Like, one can have strong feelings about gun laws and strong feelings that nobody should shoot each other in a matter of political violence, and you shouldn't blame your opponents for doing it all at the same time, right? I know a lot of strong people, strong Second Amendment supporters, gun owners who believe in things like gun safety and also think political violence is bad. I think conflating them is a bit of a mistake.
So let's go a little bit earlier than the Saturday White House Press Association dinner, whether it was about the First Amendment or about a bunch of journalists having a good time. What was different about it was that the tradition seems to have been that you would have a comedian as the MC who would make fun of the president, and that was a part of the celebration, if you will, of the freedom of the press, going back to medieval times when there was a court jester, but he didn't, if he made a joke about that the king didn't like, off with his head. So that always struck me as being, pretty healthy, and the most powerful man in the world, or possibly even a woman, but that hasn't happened yet, is able to be made fun of, I think is a very healthy thing. This time around, prior to this dinner, there was a meeting at the U.S. Institute of Peace, now renamed the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace, hosted by Larry Ellison's son, who owns CBS and is now in the process of owning Warner Brothers and CNN. All of the CBS people were there, including Nora O'Donnell, by the way, along with Barry Weiss and the head of the White House Press Association, who ended up being the MC on Saturday night. She was there as well. But is there a possibility that this is really about the game being rigged? In other words, somebody made the decision not to have a comedian because Trump hates comedians, and have the so-called mentalist. And, the idea that a friendly oligarch could buy up a storied press asset like CBS News, is that really about the sort of perversion of the notion of speaking truth to power as opposed to having plutocratic power impose its own truth?
A good and complicated question, a lot going on there. And I used to help run the U.S. Institute of Peace. I have very strong feelings about what's become of it. None of those feelings are good. I love that there historically had been comedians at the White House Correspondents Association dinner, that the president has a bit of humility, and it's very much an insider's club, right? DC is a really super small town, and it's a chance for everybody, the journalists and the Pauls and the super insiders, to just kind of relax a little bit, have some drinks and some dinner, and make fun of each other a little bit, and in good fun and with good spirit. And most presidents have been up to that. President Trump is notoriously prickly. I think he likes comedians that make fun of other people. He doesn't like comedians who make fun of him. He's not very good at being the butt of jokes. And I think the court jester analogy is a good one. You know, sometimes comedians can point out truths that others can't. That's not really what the founders had in mind when they were considering the First Amendment and the Constitution. Yes, it falls under free speech, but, you know, I'm not sure that's what they were thinking about. And it's also true that Thomas Jefferson, obviously one of the founders, the architects of the American founding documents, was a firm believer in the freedom of the press until he was elected president, at which point he thought there were all a bunch of knuckleheads who should be silenced as quickly as possible. So yeah, I wish we had a president and a press corps who could laugh together and who took their jobs seriously, but didn't take themselves seriously all of the time. Hopefully we can get back to that, right? You know, if you're gonna dish it out, you ought to be able to take it. And I think we'd be in a better place if our elected officials and our journalists and our pundits and everybody else could, you know, allow people to make fun of them in good spirit as well. You know, I'm not sure that there's a cabal at the top of CBS that's going to dictate no more jokes about President Trump because we're a bunch of oligarchs who would like another boat. I'm not sure any oligarchy is that organized. But it is a problem when media power is consolidated into a handful of people, all of whom want things from the White House. And some of those things are FCC rulings. Some of them are rulings on antitrust. Some of them are tax breaks. You know, the current media industry, as you know, well better than I do, is very big and very complicated, and it needs things from governments to operate. It needs licenses. It needs funding. It needs permission to do things. And I think that's where you don't want to get on the wrong side of the president because, you know, he's made it pretty clear that if you do something he doesn't like, he'll hit back. And unfortunately, he hits back at journalists, right? Anybody who's in the press, anybody who's quoted in the press or who runs for office has to be okay with getting yelled at, getting attacked. And if you're not okay with getting yelled at or getting attacked by reporters or by people who read your comments, then don't be in the press, don't run for office, right? I mean, that seems to be kind of the threshold. You know, I think that the press is not doing its job if they don't hold power to account, no matter who's in power. Right. I mean, I've worked, as you said, for 3 members of the House, a senator, and 1 presidential administration, all Democrats. And not everything that's written about me or my bosses was super flattering. I didn't like all of it. Some of it wasn't always entirely true, but you roll with it because it comes with the gig. And I think if we got back to a president that understood that the role of the press was to be kind of a pain, we'd all be in a better place.
So given your experience, Peter, how do you rate Trump? Because he seems to have an inordinate ability to shape the media narrative. I mean, many people think it's his reality TV training on The Apprentice, where a guy with not a very stellar business record was turned into a business genius. So he's always able to do the reality show cliffhanger at the end of the day, stay tuned for the next episode, and basically keep us, you know, whipsawed. I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed people and then had to call them back and say, I'm sorry, but the entire ground has shifted because President Trump has done something. And would you mind if we re-interviewed you because we weren't talking about the new 900-pound gorilla in the living room?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Sort of there are 2 parts to this. One is a lot of people who work in traditional journalism, in your field or in my field, who think about politics, get frustrated or confused by President Trump because he isn't behaving like a rational political actor, right? No other politician would do this. No rational political actor would say A or do B. But if you think about President Trump, not as a traditional politician, but as a guy who has been a real estate developer and basically rents his name to things. He puts his name on casinos, steaks, Bibles, airplanes, hotels, whatever, put his name on a reality TV show, as you said, and then makes money from that and then walks away when it fails. Then it makes total sense. He's really good at the grand opening. He's good at the sales pitch. He's good at the hustle. He's sharp-elbowed. He'll get the deal done. He then walks away. And if the deal goes sideways, if the casinos go bankrupt, as they did in Atlantic City, that's somebody else's problem, right? Real people got hurt. People lost their jobs. People lost a lot of money, but that's kind of how business goes. In that context, Trump's behavior is entirely rational and makes a lot of sense. The problem is he's playing real estate developer, renting his name showman on the country and on world affairs. And that's where it gets really dangerous. The second thing I would note is the fact that he's able to do this successfully is proven by this conversation. There's a lot happening in the world right now, in the Middle East, in the South China Sea, in Latin America. We've got the climate crisis is ongoing. We still don't have a fully funded federal budget. You know, there are the crises roaming the streets freely. And we are spending a half an hour talking about why Donald Trump yelled at a reporter on 60 Minutes. It seems to me that most people mostly don't care about that. Most people I know had no idea what the Washington White House Correspondents' Dinner is. And I live in Washington, D.C., right? I play pickup soccer on Sunday mornings, and I showed up to the field on Sunday morning, and a couple of guys said, hey, we were at the dinner last night. I said, no, but I have some friends where it's really scary. Like, oh, great. And then we moved on. This is just not part of their daily lives. What is part of their daily lives is $5 a gallon gas. It's college tuition that costs $100,000 a year. It's healthcare costs that are out of control. And I think the American people would really rather that journalists, politicians, and candidates talk about real stuff that matters to them and not, you know, a sideshow, I don't want to make the conversation a sideshow, but not, you know, the press covering the press, about a thing that happened at a party for the press.
Well, now you put me in a position, Peter, where I have to defend myself. And that is that, you know, in the last few days, I've covered what happened on Saturday was actually an assassination attempt on a president of the United States, and that is a pretty big headline.
It's a huge deal. That's a huge deal.
Yeah, and I also did it in the context of the geopolitics that you just mentioned, from the Persian Gulf to the gas pump, and that is that, you know, the president of the United States did, on the first day of his war on Iran, along with the Israelis, did assassinate the head of a state. So, you know, this raises questions of our inordinate power of the United States military machine, able to inflict enormous amount of punishment abroad, but how our vulnerability at home, where some lone wolf character can take a pot shot at the president, or at least try to. And it's happened to this president 3 times now.
Yeah, it's terrifying. It's really terrifying. Every president has assassination attempts. You know, President Obama, there were a lot of serious attempts, not as high profile, but on President Obama. President Reagan, of course, was shot at the hotel, same hotel at which President Trump was speaking on Saturday night. And, you know, we need less political violence. Political leaders across the spectrum need to say, this is not okay. When elected officials and candidates get death threats from people who disagree with them, we're in a very bad place as a country. And I think the more politicians who can repeat that line, the better off we'll be.
Well, let's hope that happens, and particularly amongst the Republican politicians who are now pitching the Trump ballroom as a solution to the having lone people show up at hotels to shoot presidents, that it's a safer venue. So the very dialogue that you're calling for is yet to happen. But
that's absolutely right. And the ballroom claims are completely unsurprising. Most clever people who work in policy find any event and say, see, that proves me right. This is a reason why I'm right. This is even if those two things are disconnected, because they have a point they want to prove. There's an event that go, aha, that event proves my point. Like the whole ballroom conversation is just, it's so bad for so many reasons. But I think the way we get out of this box isn't people like you and me saying, hey, this is a terrible place to be. It's part of it. But I think what really will change things is when voters say, we're done, right? Elected officials can only get unelected. They can't get more elected. So if incumbent elected officials feel like they're going to get unelected, if they feel like they're going to lose, if they continue to support Trump, or if they continue to promote political violence or distract from the issues that really matter, then they will stop behaving that way, right? If a candidate thinks, you know, if I talk about bringing down gas prices and stop making fun of people, I'm going to get a lot of votes. If I keep making fun of people or threatening people and not talking about gas, I'm going to lose a lot of votes. That's an easy choice. You talk about things that matter to real people most of the time. But until voters do that, right, or until people turn off the TV when they hear hate, or when they stop feeding the algorithms, and stop clicking on articles that highlight hate, we're not going to change, right? We have to. It really comes down to votes and dollars, and the people in charge of votes and dollars are voters and people who buy things. So we need to stop voting for people who promote violence and division, and we need to stop clicking on articles that highlight violence and division.
Well, Peter Loge, I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Very much. Thanks very much for the time. I hope you feel better. You sound really official with the hoarseness. It sounds, but I bet it's a little bit painful and not so much fun on your end. So hope you feel better soon.
It's getting a little old, but hopefully the antibiotics will kick in. So, and again, I've been speaking with Peter Loge, who's a professor and the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs and director of the Project on Ethics in Political Communication at George Washington University. He has more than 30 years of experience in politics and communications, including a presidential appointment at the Food and Drug Administration, and he held senior positions for Senator Edward Kennedy and 3 members of the United States House of Representatives. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with an assessment of what kind of repair job King Charles is doing for Anglo-American relations with his charm offensive at the White House and the U.S. Congress today.
I'm sick and tired of hearing things from uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocritics. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. I've had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, pig-headed politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. No shorthead.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Toby Miller, a British Australian American Cultural Studies and Media Studies scholar. He is a distinguished professor in Media and Cultural Studies at Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey in Guadalajara, Mexico, and has taught at Cardiff University and Loughborough University in London, and was a professor at New York University. He hosts the podcast Cultural Studies, and his most recent books include Violence, The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture, How Green Is Your Smartphone, and A Better World. Welcome to Background Briefing, Toby Miller.
Great to be with you again, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And today, King Charles and Camilla met at the White House for a sort of garden party. And then King Charles spoke today to the U.S. Congress. He made a pitch for NATO, pointing out that NATO invoked Article 50 after the 9/11 attacks, and they answered the call, as our peoples have done so for more than a century, shoulder to shoulder. And of course, he's going to the 9/11 memorial tomorrow in New York City. But he also made a pitch for Ukraine in saying today that same unyielding resolve is needed for the defense of Ukraine and her most courageous people in order to secure a truly just and lasting peace. So those are not Trump's favorite subject matters, so I guess there's a little distance there. And then he closed his speech in the Congress by saying, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Vice President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, America's words carry weight and meaning as they have since independence. These actions President Lincoln understood so well with his reflection in the magisterial Gettysburg Address that the world may little note what we say, but will never forget what we do. The king then went on to reaffirm the relationship between the two nations ahead of the 250th birthday of the United States, closing out his speech. Let our two countries rededicate ourselves to each other in the selfless service of our peoples and of all the peoples of the world. God bless the United States. So, good job, Charlie.
He even quoted Oscar Wilde, maybe the first time that a monarch has quoted Oscar Wilde, or at least quoted any queer dramatist and poet before Congress. I wonder what some of the more reactionary members of that institution thought. That is, of course, if they'd heard of Oscar Wilde. But more seriously, Ian, what you are alluding to is obviously a very clear message from the British government about two very important topics that, as you say, make the current office holder of the US presidency uncomfortable or angry, namely NATO and Ukraine. And it's important to note that King Charles is what's called a constitutional monarch. So for those of you not familiar with the concept, that's not like the absolute monarchy of the past. It's a monarch whose actions are constrained by a constitution, sometimes written, sometimes not, and who essentially is the head of state rather than a political figure. And his or her public remarks are largely determined by the government of the day, in this case, His Majesty's British government. So it's quite clear that what's going on with this speech, inter alia, is that the current British administration is answering back to Trump and the Republican Party over the question of the operation of NATO, and specifically the aggression in Iran, as well as the question of support for Ukraine.
So what did he say about Oscar Wilde? What did he quote? Do you remember?
Yes, it's actually a rather wonderful remark by Oscar Wilde that the British, at least, have always found very funny, and no doubt the Irish as well. He said today, as Oscar Wilde said, we have really everything in common with America nowadays, except, of course, language. Ho, ho, ho. So this is an attempt at a joke, but it is also a point about the interlinkage of the nations. The British, particularly the English, are very keen on the notion that they have what they call a special relationship with the United States. This concept may mean very little to most people in the US, but it's something that consecutive British governments have always held on to as a sign that the place still matters.
Well, I guess he could have quoted Oscar Wilde in terms of how Trump has taken us into the gutter with his horrendous history and current activities. Oscar Wilde said, "We are all of us in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." So let's talk about how successful then you think King Charles is doing in a repair job for Anglo-American relations, because this charm offensive seems to be working on a personal level, whether or not Trump will bristle at the politics of NATO support and supporting Ukraine. But nevertheless, every picture you've seen from the garden party, etc., there's a state dinner tonight. All you see is that usually expressionless First Lady smiling away and Trump laughing at King Charles's jokes. So it seems like he's doing a good job, and that's probably all that matters with Trump, isn't it?
At a personal level, that may well be so, but we must remember that Trump is, as it were, nothing if not inconsistent. And whilst many people say he always does what he says, that might be true at the minute that he says it, but then he might do the opposite 5 minutes later. So the idea of a repair of the relationship between the countries is, I think, problematic. That said, when it comes to NATO, when it comes to all sorts of other alliances, formal and informal, the Five Eyes deal on spying that the British and the Australians and the Canadians and so on have with the United States, that sort of apparatus, that machinery of espionage, of the military, of formal alliances, to be honest, that goes on and will always go on regardless of the occupant of the White House. It's just about collaboration between people who have more or less similar ideological commitments and have very, very long-standing infrastructural, interpersonal connections. So whilst it may well be that 5 minutes after Charles and Queen Camilla leave the United States, Trump commences again his claims that Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, is an appeaser per the Second World War and is no Winston Churchill. Nevertheless, NATO, whatever we might think of it, is as strong today, frankly, as it was 10, 15, 20 years, minutes, hours ago.
Well, I can't say that about the United States. Trump has weakened this country across the board in every sense. both militarily, diplomatically, culturally, economically, in terms of science, in terms of education, in terms of the way the world sees us. The world is furious with the United States at the moment. The South Koreans and the Japanese are furious about the energy costs. So are the Australians, who are running out of jet fuel and every other thing. In about a week, I think they won't have any. European countries are paying through the nose now for energy. So I guess none of this was spoken and will be spoken tonight at the White House, but this is an odd time to be praising the President of the United States, who the world will condemn for what he's doing and is continuing to do.
Look, I acknowledge everything you say, Ian, and it's clear that his grasp of geopolitics is non-existent. It appears as though he either did not receive adequate briefs about the probable eventuality of bombing Iran and seeking to take over from the current regime, or he just didn't understand those things. In the same way, it's clear he doesn't understand NATO. King Charles, as he now is, for you and me and for our generation, he will always be the prince because he was for 70 years. What King Charles was talking about when he referred to September 11th, 2001, and NATO's support and involvement with the United States is that was under the terms of the Charter of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a clear instance, it was thought, of an attack on one member of the Charter and hence on all. Now, the problem with Trump's assault on Iran, ill-advised, incompetent, amateurish, expensive, and with terrible implications for so many countries around the world, is that he doesn't realize that if you actually begin an assault on another country without clear provocation, that has nothing to do with the terms of trade of NATO and what is an obligation of allies. The only way that would work would be if they did as they did with Iraq. Again, appalling, but nevertheless, they went about it in diplomatically the correct ways. Under both Bushes, they built up an alliance of nation states prepared to fight with them in advance. Trump isn't capable of doing that. And so as a consequence, he has to flail around and look for things to blame. So on the one hand, as I'm saying to you, NATO is actually operationally very strong. On the other, the hand on the till of United States foreign policy is extremely irregular and incompetent and fails even to do the basic diligence required of how to set up arrangements with other countries if you're going to go on this kind of maniacal misadventure.
Well, Toby Miller, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's my pleasure, Ian. All the best.
And again, I've been speaking with Toby Miller, a British Australian American Cultural Studies and Media Studies scholar. He is the Distinguished Professor in Media and Cultural Studies at the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey in Guadalajara, Mexico, and has taught at Cardiff University and Loughborough Universities in London, and was a professor at New York University. He hosts the podcast Cultural Studies, and his most recent books include Violence, The Persistence of Violence, Colombian Popular Culture, and How Green Is Your Smartphone, and A Better World. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon and Asher Price. And if you've missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can visit us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for the daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. And you can find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media managers, Evan and Luke Susswood, are also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.